I mean, it's Japan became fascist.
Is that okay?
They had like a fascist revolt like in the 90s. But what do they mean by fascist? Do they just mean kind of like? Oh yeah, no shit, yeah. That bit. I actually forgot that. Yeah. I thought they meant like the modern day. Like I thought these things.
So I went down a rabbit hole and I've written up like a 6 or 7 page.
The real fact is a good document. So there was like an officers' revolt at one point, like, and before that, like, yeah, and there was like the state played like a big role in like Japan, like it was like a conscious kind of. It's been ages since I read this, but I did find like a really good old document.
Long story short,
Yeah.
mine was no way.
There's one thing that I read that was like really like crucial to understand. It was by the American some guy that are students.
Was that already?
By what? I don't think his name.
Still contrasting first.
Hi everyone. Hello. Thank you for coming. I hope everyone who wants a cup of tea has a cup of tea and satisfy our cookies and cups of tea. So yeah. Ron and Sasha, you guys ready for us to start?
Sure.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So yeah, welcome. So this is a meeting hosted by the Revolutionary Communist Party here in Leeds. And tonight's meeting is going to be on women's oppression, the origins of women's oppression. But I think the thing with women's oppression is that what we don't want from this meeting, or the purpose of this meeting, isn't to just kind of list and tell everyone in the room which women's oppression exists, or the different types of women's oppression that exist. The purpose of it really is to go deeper than that and to explain why it exists, and most importantly, how we can fight it, and what we can do to finally end women's oppression, and actually all oppression at its root. Spoiler alert, it has a lot to do with the class system and capitalism. So Netta is going to do a kind of a talk and go into detail about this, and then we'll have time for discussion where people can come in. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Netta.
Thank you very much, Maya. So International Women's Day is on the 8th of March every year. And well, what gains can we list off for women in these past few years? We've got Kemi Badenoch, who is the first Black female leader of the Conservative Party, how progressive. Kamala Harris was the first woman of colour who served as Vice President in the White House. And Rachel Reeves is the first ever woman Chancellor of the Exchequer who is carrying out austerity instead of a man. And of course, we have Meloni, a woman leading Italy. Now, before some of you think you've walked into the wrong room today, we know that these aren't real victories at all, and that the real situation for women, for the overwhelming majority of women, is in actuality a lot worse. 1 in 3 pregnant women experiences domestic abuse, and this is often the hotspot for abuse starting. Every day, 137 women and girls across the world are killed by a family member or intimate partner. A lot of this is from women escaping abusive relationships. 45% of all abortions are unsafe, which creates 800 maternal deaths every single day. The practice of honour killings still plagues society, and FGM as well is still mutilating young girls. And for those of you who don't know what female genital mutilation is, it includes the removal of any external genitalia, often with a razor and no painkillers whatsoever. And then you are sewn up with just a tiny hole left for when you are basically handed off to your husband one day, like the sexual property you are. And here I would mention as well the statistics on sexual harassment and assault. But unfortunately, I can imagine every single woman in this room has their own story or knows someone who does. The question of women's oppression is something that radicalizes a lot of people. It certainly radicalized me. But what can we do with all of this turmoil? What can we do with all of this anger and despair? Well, Marxism has the answer to this. Marxism not only offers us a clear explanation on the origins of women's oppression, but also, most importantly, a clear path of how to fight it. And the traditions, and the actual true traditions of International Working Women's Day are communist ones. Clara Zetkin was a German communist who founded this day back in 1910 with the help of the Second Communist International to celebrate the advance the cause of working women. And today we are reclaiming its traditions. So there is an idea that women are biologically hardwired to be oppressed, which pollutes society. Some think that it's testosterone that makes men the natural aggressors, and some argue that it's women's capacity to reproduce that makes them docile and controllable by nature. This gives us a biological reality, something we have to sit back and accept. It's just human nature, we can't change it. But as communists, we maintain the fact that the origins of women's oppression is rooted in the changing material conditions of society. We argue that it is the changing material and economic conditions that create the oppression of women, and not some biological reality or attitude. Friedrich Engels, one of the founding fathers of Marxism, along with, of course, Marx, in particular, developed the Marxist approach to the oppression of women in his book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which I would highly recommend everyone here reads. And he based this largely on the work of the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, who conducted, I can't quite understate this, the most groundbreaking research of this time. And this was because Morgan had an extremely materialist approach to his studies. And what Morgan's discovery was that there was progress in history. Even though he wasn't a revolutionary, the ruling class hated him because his research showed that customs and norms like the nuclear or bourgeois family were not timeless and unchangeable, but actually changed depending on the economic base of society. And he was hated by the bourgeoisie because this has extremely revolutionary implications, right? You know, there was no longer a spiritual or biological essence which could justify the oppression of women due to these discoveries. If the masses wanted, they could drastically change society and depose these people at the top that disseminate these ideas. And what we see is that in pre-class society, thousands and thousands of years ago, women in the family looked much, much different. And these pre-class hunter-gatherer societies essentially had no private property. Property was held in common. There were no classes, and therefore it was sort of a primitive communism. Everyone essentially labored to contribute to a social collective wealth based on ability, and then everyone took from that social wealth based off of needs. And essentially, as humans progressed, they figured out that inbreeding produced a whole host of health complications. And out of this, early tribes or gens started to create sophisticated breeding networks in order to avoid it. And from this came about a certain type of group marriage where you could choose to mate with someone as long as they were not from your clan. This leads to the creation of partnerings that were mutually agreed upon. And often people had several partners in their lifetime, right? There wasn't monogamy. People could freely choose to end partnerships and to enter new ones. And because there was no to little private property, the question of inheritance was unimportant. And therefore, children were traced down the mother's line. You know, it's very obvious to know who someone's mother is. It's not so obvious to know who someone's father is without technology. But this wasn't an issue because it was not just the mother's responsibility to take care of the child, but it was the responsibility of the whole tribe. And in fact, during the 1600s, Western colonizers actually observed this in real life. Paul Lejeune was a Jesuit priest who went to Christianize the Montagnais Naskapé people in Canada and was really surprised by the respect that women commanded in this tribe. He basically pleaded with one of the men of this tribe, like, look, you don't even know if that's your son. Your wife could have been sleeping with someone else, essentially. That could be someone else's. And to that, he responded, essentially, that's the problem with you French. You only care about your children. We care about all the children. And women in these hunter-gatherer societies contributed equally to men. Women generally foraged for food and made tools for the tribe, where men generally went out to hunt. Although it is important to note that anthropological evidence shows that women were also hunters and men were also gatherers. But the fruits of men and women's labours in these societies were equally valuable to the social wealth everyone contributed and took from according to needs. It's also been shown that women took part in cave paintings, a hugely important part of society. And in fact, it was the women's contributions that were actually reliable. You know, the hunt didn't always produce food, but foraging was a lot more consistent. And all of this shows that the oppression of women did not exist in these early primitive communist societies. It's only during the Neolithic Revolution that we see this role in society begin to change. The Neolithic Revolution was a process that took place over thousands of years and was the process of basically the development of the productive forces through agriculture. And because of this stability created by agriculture, birth rates were rising, creating more of a domestic demand, and physically demanding manual labour like tilling started to cut women out of the workforce. They were still contributing hugely to society, but for the first time in history, it was men who now worked in these processes of production that were creating a surplus. It was the first time in human history that men and women were no longer producing equally and contributing equally to the wealth in society. But this surplus that the men were creating was still being inherited by the mothergens. And so they wanted a way to pass down their property to their own children and not their mother or their sister, essentially. And this is what Engels characterizes as the historic fall of women. To be specific, the historic fall of the female sex begins with the development of private property and the division of society into classes. There was now a patriarchal family unit where heritage was tracked down from the father's line instead of a socialized clan traced through the mothers. And women now became economically dependent on the men to provide for them. And so for men to know exactly who their children were, strict monogamy had to be imposed on women. For example, in Athenian society in ancient Greece, women were locked away in their houses, often sleeping in completely separate rooms from the husband. They were often illiterate and allowed to only leave the house when visiting other women to avoid even the slightest chance of infidelity. And this is where we also see social taboos around women's promiscuity stem from. The word virgin comes from the Latin word that means a girl or woman who is unmarried, a girl who has not yet been passed on as property to a man. And all sorts of abominations and oddities have been carried out in the name of trying to conclude if a woman was or was not a virgin, all for the purpose of ensuring, and there are some really interesting examples, but I won't list them off here, all for the purpose of ensuring the legitimacy of a male heir and passing down their private property. And were men in society held to this same standard? Are men in society held to this same standard? Absolutely not. It's the development of class society where we also see the rise of prostitution. The poorest women in society were driven by necessity to sell the only commodity at their disposal, their body, to survive. And it also illustrates the fact that polygamy was and still very much is encouraged and normal for men in society, but never has been for the women. And this nuclear family is not only a great way for men to be able to pass property onto the next generation, it is very efficient for the capitalist class to basically have half of the population stuck in the domestic realm, reproducing and upkeeping the family, whilst men sell their wage labour to the capitalist class. It creates a cheap and efficient way for the capitalist class to keep reproducing its workers. And from this also stems the roots of homophobia and transphobia, as these transcend that traditional nuclear family. But just because this is the ideal form of family does not mean it's the true structure of the family. In reality, women have always worked, whether that's in the home, paid jobs, or both. During the Industrial Revolution, for example, the expanding demands of capitalism meant that the poorest women in society were dragged into the workforce, sometimes as domestic servants, and sometimes in factories. And now women are in the workforce en masse, right? But this does not mean that the family has become wealthier or the domestic burden has lessened. But now women face a dual burden, where they are working long hours, but still have to do all of the domestic labour at home as well. And so women take on some of the most precarious jobs in society out of desperation and necessity, because the state will never foot this domestic bill. In fact, don't let me, a communist, tell you this. Listen to what The Economist has to say. In America, with its booming economy and tight labour market, women are proving a godsend to many employers. They usually cost less to employ than the men, are more prepared to be flexible and less inclined to kick up a fuss if working conditions are poor, and far fewer of them are members of trade unions. Because it's also the industries that overwhelmingly employ women that are the worst paid, worst conditions, and most unstable. Care workers, nurses, hospitality industry, retail, cleaning jobs, because these are often part-time with precarious contracts that women who need to find a way of combining a job and a family are forced to take. And this also works quite well for the capitalists, as they can assert that women have these precarious jobs, not because of the material conditions they face, but because they are biologically inferior and they're designed to be that way. As well, creepy managers get away with sexual harassment and assault of women precisely because workers don't run their own workplaces. They use their power over workers to abuse them and get away with it scot-free. If a council existed for every workplace consisting of the people that actually works there, and they made the decisions of how their workplace was run, in other words, a Soviet, this is what a Soviet is, if a vote could be held to remove these abusers from their workplace, these perpetrators wouldn't last 2 seconds, I can guarantee it. The capitalist class maintains itself by pitting workers against each other to scapegoat various groups and avoid the blame as the true perpetrators of barbarism in society. And this conjures up the evils of not just sexism, but racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia too. We can see this all around us, Andrew Tate and his vile grind, I don't want to mention his name, give him any more oxygen, tells these young boys that the reason the world around them is crumbling is not because of the capitalist class at the top of society, but because women are not submitting to them like they used to. So it's clear to see that capitalism survives by and benefits from the oppression of women. They are easier to exploit and give less pay, making the capitalists bigger profits. And it gives the ruling class another group they can pit against one another to fight amongst themselves instead of uniting against our bosses. And who do cuts and austerity impact the most? What is the first to be cut? Services for women who are victims of abuse. Childcare services are cut, which drags women back into the homes and out of the workforce. And as employers look for jobs to cut, women are often the first to go because they don't want to foot the bill for maternity pay, etc., etc. But what does the lowering of wages and increased cost of living do? It forces women to be stuck in relationships they do not want because they are entirely financially dependent on a man. And capitalism is entirely and completely dependent on the oppression of women for its survival. The two cannot and never will be separated. Capitalism can simply not afford what would be necessary for the emancipation of women, and they cannot profit from it. The pages aren't separating. There we go. So, as communists, we cannot simply be against something, but we must be for something as well. And what do we propose to replace this bourgeois family with? Well, we want to replace it with the worker state. And what that means is that the wealth that is held by the tiny 0.1% in society would be taken into the hands of the workers, and what was to be done with it would be decided by the workers. The billions that are spent on building private islands or manufacturing bombs to kill civilians in Gaza would be spent towards the actual needs of society. We could invest in good healthcare, public nurseries, canteens, laundromats, which would completely alleviate the domestic burden of women. A woman would be given full working rights, higher pay, and the working day would be reduced significantly, not just for women workers, but for all workers. And this would completely free women from the home and also their grueling working lives, right? They would be able to participate in art, in science, in culture, in a meaningful way for the first time in history. And the Bolsheviks actually managed to begin to put these ideas into practice after the Russian Revolution. I'd like to say as well that it was International Working Women's Day that started the Russian Revolution. It was female textile workers that came out on strike on International Working Women's Day that sparked the start of the February Revolution, that deposed the Tsar in Russia and changed the world forever. And because of the Russian Revolution in 1917, it was the first country in the entire world to grant universal suffrage for women. It was the revolutionary pressure across the world that led to these democratic rights being granted in other countries later on. The Russian Revolution also made completely monumental gains, like the right to divorce, the right to maternity pay, which women in developed countries like the US don't even get today. The outlawing of heavily pregnant women or women that have just given birth from working unsociable hours or night shifts. Homosexuality was decriminalized and abortion was legalized. All of this in a country where backwards religious beliefs were deeply ingrained in the majority of the population, and where unfaithful peasant women were essentially often publicly humiliated by being stripped naked and beaten in public. And this goes to show how quickly attitudes can change through the force of revolution and material change, right? Obviously, sexist ideas will not disappear overnight, but they can only start to disappear when the reason for them disappears too. I mean, could you imagine a generation of men who grew up in a world where backwards attitudes towards women just didn't exist, right? Women were not private property to men and they could live completely independently of them. Women could actually pursue their passions free from any constraint and be able to be in relationships because of love and not economic necessity. And this is what we are fighting for, right? And this is what our methods flow from. We fight against any and all methods and ideas that distract us from achieving this final goal of overthrowing capitalism. We oppose any ideas that sow illusions in the capitalist system to solve not only the women's question, but any issue in society, because it can't. And this is why it is so stomach-turning to see the representatives of capitalism appropriate International Working Women's Day for their own narrow interests. If you look at the official International Women's Day website, it harps on about increasing the representation of women in higher ranking jobs and celebrates female CEOs and politicians. You know, if these liberal feminists got their way, what do they think a female Jeff Bezos would do? Do they think that the estrogen coursing through her body would make her inherently kinder and fairer to the workers she exploits? Of course not, you're giggling. And if she did treat her employees more kindly and gave them higher wages, she would be outcompeted by the bosses who were willing to do that. It is the cold logic of capitalism that conditioned the minds of men and women, and not the other way around. And it is this thinking that is just as reactionary as the Andrew Tates of the world, as it asserts that there is some sort of biological essence that makes women more kind and nurturing and fair. We understand that to end the oppression of women, you must first get rid of the material basis in which it thrives, the capitalist system which puts profit before needs. You know, if you've left some food out for too long and it starts growing mold, you don't simply just like wipe off the mold and expect the issue to be fine and the food to be fine, but rather you've got to do away with the reason it's growing in the first place, or it will only come back and eventually consume the whole thing. And the philosophy of postmodernism is really the head of the hydra when it comes to derailing women's liberation, and has completely poisoned the entire movement. The philosophy can basically be boiled down to the idea that truth is subjective to the individual, and posits that by simply changing our language, our individual behaviour, we can effectively combat oppression. This leads to the common ideas of liberal feminism today, right? Now, whilst communists want to absolutely deal with the copious, vile amounts of ideas surrounding women, this cannot be done whilst the reason for it still exists. We have to grasp at the roots, right? And this is what liberal feminism becomes. It's a way of throwing sand in our eyes and insulting us. Out of this philosophy also comes identity politics, which maintains that a person's lived experience and identity determines truth. If you are not of that identity, you cannot claim to understand the roots of that form of oppression and therefore the solution to its abolition, right? A white man could not possibly weigh in on the women's question. And Kamala Harris is a striking example of this. Her whole campaign for president was centered around her being a woman of color. But what she was trying to inherit was the world's most reactionary and powerful imperialist power in the world. Do you think the women of Gaza were rejoicing at the thought of a woman of colour bombing them instead of a white man? Absolutely not. She also heavily relied on the issue of abortion in order to try and rake in as many female voters as humanly possible. Rake in as many women who are rightfully terrified of their right to abortion being repealed even further. But what Kamala Harris did not tell voters is that the Democrats had plenty of time and opportunity to pass federal legislation protecting Roe v. Wade in law and preventing its overturn, but they didn't, precisely so they could use it as a cynical tool to dangle in front of terrified working women. So we are told that intersectionality and identity politics are a way for the left to fight oppression. But in reality, it is the ruling class's favourite tool to keep the working class divided and far away from revolutionary conclusions. In 2018, there was a women's strike in Spain, basically to fight against sexual violence in the workplace, pay, etc., etc. But the organisers of this strike asserted that the men should stay at home so that the women could come out to strike, essentially. But unfortunately, the whole point of a strike is to bring society to a standstill. What they did here was essentially encourage the men to scab on their own strike, to break their own strike, and weaken the movement as a whole. And this is an example of identity politics dividing the working class up and weakening their collective power to bring society to a halt. A revolution requires every single layer of working class people to participate, and a single layer of society alone is not enough. Black people, queer people, women, men, it's precisely our role in production that gives us the power to bring the system down. And men cannot do that without women, and women cannot do that without men. Another way identity politics actively drives us away from revolutionary conclusions is that we are often told that Marx and Lenin are old white men who have nothing to say on the women's question and even oppress women themselves sometimes. And this is certainly what I was taught. Because of this, I turned my nose up at Marxism for a very long time when looking for the answers to fighting women's oppression. I was told that it was because of their identity that they would have nothing valuable to contribute. But describing oppression is very different to explaining it. You can find copious amounts of books describing the 1,000,001 ways in which women are oppressed. In fact, I used them to write this lead off partially. But in reality, Marxism is the only way to be able to truly understand the origins of women's oppression and, most importantly, how to actually fight it. If we accepted the ideas of identity politics, it would mean we would have to maintain that parts of the working class actually benefited from the capitalist system. The white man would be the most privileged because of his gender and race. A white woman would still have some privilege because of her race, etc., etc. But the suggestion that the working class has anything to gain from maintaining the capitalist system is completely false. It is true that different layers of the working class face different forms of oppression to different degrees, but it is in the entire working class's interest to fight oppression and overthrow this rotten system all the same. It is not in the interests of the CEOs of the world to encourage the overthrow of capitalism, as quite frankly, it would threaten her profits. They do not and never will represent the interests of working class women, and we will not be deceived by them. We're not just interested in tackling the symptoms, but in curing the disease. We need to overthrow this rotten system and replace it with a system that liberates every layer of society, and that is socialism and communism. And as communists, we don't just want to wait for revolution to happen to advance the interests of working class women. We fight for any reforms that improve the life of the working class. But the point is that all reforms that have been offered to women have been fought at tooth and nail for. No reform is given out willingly by the capitalist class. And when these reforms have been won, the capitalist class are eagerly waiting to repeal it as soon as crisis hits or they can get away with it. For example, I'm sure any reactionary will come to you and be like, well, women have equality in the law, didn't you know that? They have legal equality. And you know what? They would be right in some respects. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 is an example of this. It supposedly prohibits pay discrimination between genders. The ruling class did not give us this graciously, but forced them to pass it because of huge revolutionary pressure from the US, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and revolutionary movements happening across the world. And what triggered it in the UK was working class women who worked in the Ford factories coming out on strike and completely halting car production. Yet in reality, the capitalist class do their very best to make their way around this legislation. For example, by keeping wages lower in industries that predominantly hire women. There can't be wage discrimination against men and women if they're all paid the same low wage. The TUC points out that the average hourly rate of pay in women for men in Britain today, is £26, and yet for women it is £18. And what we can see here is that all reforms we win under capitalism will only ever be partial and can be just as easily removed later down the line. As the Third Congress of the Communist International points out, the equality of women, the true equality of women, as opposed to formal or superficial equality, will only be achieved under communism. And so, women have always and will always play an instrumental role in revolution. There's nothing you can do to stop them. In fact, women have always played the most inspiring, heroic, and sacrificial roles in them. In Bangladesh's War of Independence in the 1970s, women were at the forefront of the fight and often had to sacrifice everything to partake. Layla Ahmed was a medical student who, after her father was shot by the West Pakistani army, sold all of her belongings and walked hundreds of miles to join the Gobra training camp in Kolkata, developing an abscess and kidney infection in the process. And this was a special women's training camp organizing 234 female fighters. Many of these women were members of the Communist Party or Socialist student group. And she recounted that every woman in that camp vowed not to sleep on pillows until Bangladesh was free. During the Arab Spring of 2011 in Egypt, women again played an absolutely instrumental role and flooded the streets on par with men. In fact, it was the first strikes in the very first strike action taken by textile workers in Mahala in December 2006, which arguably started the chain of reaction of events that led to the revolution, that women workers famously left their workstations and began to chant, "Here are the women, where are the men?" And in fact, during the occupation of the Tahrir Square, there was copious amounts of men taking advantage of it by sexually harassing the women there. And what did these revolutionaries do? They went around pinning them down and spray painting the words abusers on them, tagging them and publicly humiliating them and getting them off their streets, taking them out of their revolution. In the region of Rojava in Syria, the YPJ is an all-female defense force that are some of the most feared and successful fighters against Islamic fundamentalists like ISIS in that region. These incredible women, pretty much all of them, come from backgrounds where they have escaped child marriages, forced marriages, and domestic abuse, where they are seen as nothing more than literal property, and they become trained up to use weapons in military strategy and become snipers and things like that. And it's because of this that they are such ferocious fighters. They know that if they are captured by ISIS, unthinkable things will happen to them, so they fight until the bitter end, with many examples of these women becoming martyrs in order to defend the region and their comrades. And I think this really illustrates that it is women in society that often have the least to lose and the most to gain by becoming fighters in the class struggle. So whilst we might not be training women with rifles just yet, we are arming ourselves. We are arming ourselves with revolutionary ideas, and this is what the RCP does. A 15th century medieval physician, Niccolo Felucci, thought that you could confirm if a woman was a virgin by basically fumigating her under a sheet of the finest coal, and if you couldn't smell or taste it, then she was a virgin. You all look really confused, some of you have giggled, and because it's an entirely ridiculous idea to us. Why? Because society has progressed, and so have our ideas. We cannot truly imagine what ideas we have about women today that we will be laughing at in centuries to come, and I truly believe that that future can exist. There is a very popular song in the Labour movement called Bread and Roses, associated with the women's class struggle. One of the lyrics reads, "Hearts starve as well as bodies, give us bread, but give us roses." And what these lyrics are saying is that whilst we fight for all material gains for women, we are also fighting for the complete unshackling of our potential. Once the workers have control of society and the wealth in society is distributed based on need and not profit, women would be freed from the dual burden and be able to participate in art and culture and science and ideas. But this potential can only be overcome with the overthrow of capitalism and the conscious planning of society by the working class. It is our task not to let the immense sacrifice of the women that came before us be in vain. It is our task not to let the ruling class patronize us and throw sand in our eyes. It is our task to avenge the rape, the murder, the betrayal, the violence that our comrades have faced in their fight for a better world. It is our task to stay completely focused and finish what they had started and do away with capitalism once and for all. We will not be complacent. We will not be docile and accept our oppression. We are fighters. Women are fighters. And it is true now more than ever that a woman's place is not in the home, it's not in the kitchen, it's not behind her husband. A woman's place is in the revolution, and it's in the Revolutionary Party.
Shata. I think that was a really good way to kick off the discussion. So I think before we kind of I open it up and I invite people to ask any questions, which I really encourage.